The wind on the Don River steppe could flay the skin from a man's face. In January 1943, that wind howled across a frozen landscape where an entire army was dying in silence. It was the coldest winter Europe had seen in generations. Temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius, snow crusted over corpses, rifles frozen to dead hands. In the middle of that white wilderness, 1,000 German soldiers from the 3rd Battalion, 376th Infantry Regiment marched east and were never seen again. Their disappearance was first recorded in a single line of a divisional report. Contact with 3/376 lost, 19th January 1943, assumed encircled. Nothing more. No coordinates, no radio logs, no survivors. For months, nobody could explain how an entire battalion could simply vanish. Only when the snow melted that spring did Soviet patrols stumble upon what remained. A ghostly tableau of war suspended in ice. To understand how those men vanished, we must return to the dying days of the Battle of Stalingrad. By late 1942, the German 6th Army was trapped. Field Marshal Paulus's divisions were encircled by the Red Army in a pocket stretching from Kalach to the Volga. Inside that ring, 250,000 men fought starvation, disease, and temperatures that cracked engine blocks. But the disaster at Stalingrad was only part of a much larger collapse. South of the city, on the snowbound plains of the Don and Chir rivers, German and Italian units were trying to hold the line against the Soviet winter counteroffensive known as Operation Little Saturn. When the Soviet Second Guards Army broke through in December 1942, the retreat turned into chaos. The 3rd Battalion of the 376th Infantry Regiment, roughly 1,000 men, was ordered to cover the withdrawal of the 44th Infantry Division toward the west bank of the Don. It was supposed to be a temporary rearguard action lasting a few hours. Instead, the battalion was cut off by blizzards, night assaults, and confusion in the chain of command. Most were young conscripts from Saxony and Bavaria, led by veterans who had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front. Their commander, Major Heinrich Ebeling, was a stoic career officer, known for his refusal to leave wounded behind. When radio contact with Divisional HQ failed on the evening of January 18, 1943, Ebeling decided to break out on his own initiative, westward through what maps marked as open steppe. In reality, it was a frozen ocean of snowdrifts, wind, and Soviet patrols. At 0500 hours on January 19th, the battalion began its march. Each man carried 20 rounds of ammunition, half a loaf of frozen bread, and a canteen filled with ice. Their horses had died days earlier. Machine guns and mortars were dragged on improvised sleds. They expected to reach friendly lines within 24 hours. They never arrived. When German headquarters in Milarovo realized the unit was missing, reconnaissance patrols were sent along the Don Bend. They found abandoned gun carriages, frozen horses, and tracks that vanished into the wind. No sign of combat, no shell craters, no bodies. It was as if the steppe had swallowed them whole. Weeks later, Luftwaffe pilots flying supply missions to the Stalingrad pocket reported unusual, dark shapes near the hamlet of Nizhne Cherskaya. But the area was under Soviet control, and no investigation followed. By the time spring thaw came, the 376th Infantry Regiment was officially listed as destroyed. For families back home, telegrams arrived with a single word stamped across the top: vermisst, missing. Mothers kept the stoves burning through the spring, hoping that their sons might walk back through the door when the snow melted. None did. When Soviet sappers advanced through the region in March 1943, they stumbled upon an eerie sight near a shallow depression by the frozen Don. The snow had drifted into strange shapes, mounds that, as the sun returned, began to darken. Beneath the crusted ice were rows of bodies still standing upright, rifles slung, as if awaiting orders. Some were huddled in groups around field stoves that had never been lit. Others sat in frozen circles, their faces tilted toward each other, mouths half open as though mid-conversation. It appeared there had been no battle, no shell fragments, no bullet wounds. The men had simply stopped. Frostbite and exhaustion could explain much, but not why every weapon was unfired, every position orderly, every man frozen where he stood, Captured documents recovered later in 1943 showed that Soviet 27th Guards Division had reported encountering German bodies in marching order, apparently overcome by the cold. The temperature on the night of January 19th fell to 43 degrees Celsius with wind chill. But still, why had the entire column perished without a single distress flare or signal? The Soviet political officer who inspected the site wrote in his diary, "They were ghosts before we found them. The snow kept them as it found them, faces calm, eyes open." When word of the discovery reached Moscow, the report was quietly filed away among countless others from the front. For the Red Army, it was one of many grim scenes in a war of annihilation. For historians, it became a haunting symbol of how winter itself could become a weapon. As the investigation would later reveal, the truth behind the disappearance of those 1,000 men lay not in enemy action, but in the merciless mechanics of the Eastern Front. Frostbite, starvation, and a logistical collapse so complete that death arrived without a sound. By the third week of January 1943, the Don Steppe had become a white desert. No landmarks, no roads, just snow ridges shaped by the wind into ridges like frozen waves. Major Heinrich Ebeling led from the front, a pistol on his hip, the brim of his cap encased in frost. His orders were simple on paper. Break west, link with retreating elements near Milerovo. But the map he carried was 6 months out of date, drawn before the Soviet counteroffensive had redrawn the entire front. Unknown to him, the line he sought no longer existed. Each man in the battalion had been told to carry 3 days of rations. By the morning of January 20th, those rations were gone. Canteens rattled empty. Frozen bread had become too hard to chew. The fuel tablets for the field stoves had long since been burned to warm hands rather than boil water. When the first blizzard hit that afternoon, the horizon disappeared. It wasn't snow, it was obliteration. The air itself turned white, the wind shrieking like artillery. The front and rear of the column lost visual contact, and within an hour, the battalion had split into 3 wandering groups. Communication radios failed, their batteries dead in the cold. Ebeling kept moving west by compass alone. But magnetism meant little in 40 degrees Celsius winds when the compass needle froze solid. That night, survivors later recalled, the snow seemed to glow faintly blue under a low moon. Men huddled in shallow pits they scraped with helmets. Some tried to start fires with gasoline siphoned from frozen trucks, but the fuel wouldn't ignite. Corporal Dieter Janke, a medic, wrote his last diary entry that evening on a page already stiff with frost. No sound of fighting, only wind. Faces unrecognizable under ice. We move west by faith alone. I no longer feel my feet. At dawn, the column stirred, but fewer men stood up. Several were dead in their sleep, their bodies curled around rifles like children clutching toys. The company sergeants forced the rest onward, knowing that standing still was death. By midday, the lead platoon stumbled upon a burnt-out Soviet village, just 4 log huts and a collapsed stable. They took shelter inside the blackened shells of buildings, melting snow in their helmets for water. One soldier, delirious, laughed that they had found Moscow. Another shot himself after seeing what he thought was movement under the floorboards, rats, or hallucination. Ebeling ordered them to move again before nightfall. Behind them, the snow began to drift over the footprints until even their path vanished. The battalion was now a phantom formation, wandering a landscape that erased all evidence of its passing. To Soviet patrols in the area, it was as though the Germans had ceased to exist. One Red Army lieutenant later testified, "We heard nothing for 3 days. No engines, no gunfire, only wind. Even the crows were gone." The 27th Guards Rifle Division, advancing from the south, recorded temperatures of 42 degrees Celsius at night and visibility of less than 20 meters. In those conditions, sound carried strangely. Men could hear voices a kilometer away but miss the shout of the man beside them. When the Soviets finally crossed the area weeks later, they found the bodies arranged in straight lines, as though still marching. That would become the core of the legend, the battalion that walked itself to death. Psychologists later studying the diaries recovered from the site noted something chilling. The entries stopped abruptly on January 21st. Until that day, the tone had been calm, procedural, coordinates, temperatures, strength reports. Then, a single unfinished line. We follow the light in the snow. No one knows what light they meant. Some survivors from other units described St. Elmo's fire, faint electrical glows on frozen metal that looked like ghostly lanterns in the storm. Others spoke of hallucinations brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning from makeshift stoves inside dugouts. Whatever it was, that final note marked the last trace of the battalion while alive. By the third day, frostbite had turned fingers black. Rifles jammed from frozen oil. Men collapsed mid-step, their comrades too weak to lift them. No one recorded the moment when command structure broke down. It didn't happen with rebellion or panic, just quiet surrender to the cold. Orders became murmurs, then silence. By the time the blizzard passed, the column had vanished completely. Weeks later, after the front had shifted again, a German reconnaissance group retraced the area in March 1943. They found nothing. No helmets, no insignia, only a single belt buckle protruding from a drift. Then, 20 kilometers west, they discovered what one officer called the field of sleepers. Rows of men, frozen mid-step, snow fused to their uniforms, their eyes open, unseeing. The scene defied logic. There were no shell craters, no signs of ambush or explosion. The men had not fallen in battle. They had simply stopped moving. The officer who led the reconnaissance, Lieutenant Karl Becker, wrote in his report. They were upright, some leaning on rifles, others seated as though resting. No struggle. No blood. Only calm, unnatural stillness. I have never seen anything so quiet. The Wehrmacht ordered no official investigation. By then, the German army was in full retreat from the Don Basin. The report was filed away in a collapsing headquarters, lost when Soviet troops overran the region weeks later. To the few medical examiners who later reviewed photographs of the site, the explanation was simple yet horrifying. They had died of hypothermia compounded by carbon monoxide exposure, a lethal combination common in field conditions when soldiers burned fuel inside dugouts or covered sleds for warmth. When oxygen ran out, men slipped into hallucination, stood up, and walked into the open, believing they saw lights or heard voices. Within minutes, the cold did the rest. But for the soldiers who found the bodies, no science could dispel the feeling that they had stepped into a mass grave, sculpted by winter itself. For decades, the story lingered in regimental lore. Veterans of the Eastern Front spoke of it in low tones, how the Don Steppe could take men whole. The Soviet archives listed the find as enemy casualties, approximately 1,000, cause undetermined. No one ever claimed the bodies. The site, somewhere between the frozen bends of the Cheer and Don, was left to the snow again. As spring thawed the frozen earth, scavenger birds returned. Helmets and bones emerged from the melting ice. But the Don Steppe keeps its secrets well. By the time historians sought the site after the war, it had vanished beneath new soil, the markers erased. In time, the legend grew. A German battalion that vanished not in battle, but into the winter itself, its last act not of war, but of surrender to the cold. To stay warm, some wrapped their legs in rags ripped from tent cloth, others in the torn linings of dead comrades' coats. When one soldier suggested lighting a fire, Ebeling refused. It would expose them to Soviet patrols. The fireless night that followed sealed their fate. Recovered pages from a frozen field diary, later found near the site, contain brief entries, scribbled pencil on stiff paper. The handwriting weakens, lines grow shorter, until only fragments remain. Cannot see horizon, no feeling in hands. Sergeant Mueller lost both feet. Ebeling still ahead. We are still marching. The last line, still marching, would echo later through survivor accounts from other units. Men who passed through that region weeks later said the blizzard sometimes produced the illusion of movement. Snow devils twisting across the flats, resembling columns of soldiers drifting in the distance. But on that night, the only movement was the wind. At some point before dawn, men near the center of the column reported seeing a flickering glow ahead, blue, faint, moving. Whether it was a lantern carried by the lead platoon, a Soviet, to stay warm, some wrapped their legs in rags ripped from tent cloth, others in the torn linings of dead comrades' coats. When one soldier suggested lighting a fire, Ebeling refused. It would expose them to Soviet patrols. The fireless night that followed sealed their fate. Recovered pages from a frozen field diary, later found near the site, contain brief entries, scribbled pencil on stiff paper. The handwriting weakens, lines grow shorter, until only fragments remain. Cannot see horizon, no feeling in hands. Sergeant Mueller lost both feet. Ebeling still ahead. We are still marching. The last line, still marching, would echo later through survivor accounts from other units. Men who passed through that region weeks later said the blizzard sometimes produced the illusion of movement. Snow devils twisting across the flats, resembling columns of soldiers drifting in the distance. But on that night, the only movement was the wind. At some point before dawn, men near the center of the column reported seeing a flickering glow ahead. Blue, faint, moving. Whether it was a lantern carried by the lead platoon, a Soviet flare, or a trick of the eyes, no one knows. Hypothermia can create hallucinations. As body temperature drops below 32 degrees Celsius, the brain begins to misfire, producing warmth and light where none exist. Several soldiers broke from the ranks to chase the glow. The others followed instinctively, believing they'd found the path back to friendly lines. By sunrise, the trail curved in a perfect arc, back toward the east, into the storm's teeth. The men were walking in circles. According to one Soviet account, a reconnaissance patrol from the 27th Guards Rifle Division spotted the outlines of the column just before dawn, gray figures moving slowly against the wind, some still carrying rifles. The Soviets watched through binoculars for several minutes. At first, they thought it was a trick, decoys or dummies set up to draw fire. Only when one of the figures collapsed and didn't rise did they realize these were living men, barely. The patrol commander, Lieutenant Pavel Denisov, ordered a cautious approach. He described the moment in his war diary. We saw them through snow, hundreds, maybe more. They did not shoot. They did not speak. They just kept walking, slow, mechanical. We shouted for them to halt. None reacted. Then we fired a flare. Still nothing. The Soviets held fire, unwilling to waste ammunition on ghosts. When they advanced the next morning, all movement had stopped. The blizzard passed by noon on January 22nd, leaving a landscape of glassy ice. What Denisov's men found defied belief. Hundreds of German soldiers stood half-buried in snow, some upright, others seated in shallow depressions. Their uniforms were rimmed with frost, eyelashes white, faces expressionless. It looked like a frozen bivouac, the men arranged in order, rifles slung, packs still fastened. No one appeared to have struggled. The Soviets found no bullet wounds, no defensive trenches. They had simply stopped breathing. Some clutched field maps, others, letters home, sealed in pockets of ice. One officer was found kneeling beside a crate marked rations, his gloved hands still gripping a tin opener. Another sat against a wagon wheel, a rosary frozen to his fingers. Near the center of the formation lay Major Ebeling, still upright, his pistol holstered. His watch had stopped at 2:17. What struck Soviet investigators most was the orderliness. They were arranged as if by design, platoons in rows, officers to the front, supply wagons trailing behind. No footprints led away. It was as though time itself had halted mid-command. The explanation, Soviet medical officers concluded, was collective hypothermic paralysis. At extreme cold, the body's muscles lock in the final position held before death. Because most were still on their feet, death had frozen them standing. They became what one report called a regiment of statues. The sight haunted everyone who saw it. Lieutenant Denisov wrote later, "The snow was filled with men, but no life. Even the wind seemed to fear them. The Red Army buried some of the bodies where they stood. Others were photographed for documentation. Most were never identified. When the spring thaw arrived, the permafrost released a few remains into shallow gullies that filled with meltwater. Local villagers later said the area reeked of metal and decay for months. Among the items recovered from the field was a scratched metal plate, part of a radio set. Carved into it with a bayonet point were the words, "Wir marschieren ins Licht." We march into the light. The phrase became the battalion's epitaph in military records compiled after the war. No one knows who wrote it, or when. That final radio transmission, logged at 1937 on January 21st, remained buried in Wehrmacht archives for decades. When it resurfaced in 1953, researchers noted something peculiar in the recording. After the last words, "enemy near," a faint rhythmic tapping continued for 30 seconds. At first dismissed as static, audio engineers later amplified it. The pattern spelled 3 letters in Morse, SOS, repeated twice, followed by a pause, and then a single word, barely audible through the static. Kalt. Cold. And that one word became a symbol of the entire Eastern Front, where cold itself was often deadlier than bullets. When historians visited the region in the 1970s, local farmers still referred to it as the White Field. They told of thaw seasons when helmets or bones surfaced, and of strange sounds on clear winter nights. Wind whistling through empty shell casings, mistaken for whispers. Whether those tales were superstition or memory's echo, no one could say. Soviet veterans who'd witnessed the sight avoided speaking of it in detail. As one survivor put it years later, "It wasn't horror we felt, it was silence. They had fought the snow and the snow had won." The Don steppe had consumed thousands that winter, German, Italian, Romanian, and Soviet alike. But only one unit left behind a mystery so perfect in its stillness that it transcended nationality. The battalion that vanished became a legend told in barracks and history books, a story of men undone not by enemy fire, but by the indifferent hand of nature. The snow melted in April 1943, turning the Don Basin into a sea of mud. Spring revealed what winter had concealed: wrecked trucks, abandoned helmets, skeletal horses tangled in harnesses. Soviet engineers clearing the region for new offensives came across the White Field again. What they saw this time was even stranger. Rows of dark, collapsed shapes emerging from thawing ice, the bodies now lying flat, faces to the sky. The once rigid figures had softened into the earth. The wind moaned through their empty helmets like a funeral song. To the Red Army, there was little time for ceremony. Teams of local civilians were ordered to dig shallow mass graves. Dog tags were collected, documents burned. Photographs were taken for verification. Most were later lost in the chaos of the Soviet advance.